The brutal murders of MPs Jo Cox in 2016 and Sir David Amess in 2021 shook British politics, sparking a lot of concern about the safety of all our elected representatives. The issue is still very much with us and cuts right across party lines. According to a new report from the Electoral Commission, 55% of surveyed candidates in this year's general election encountered some form of abuse or intimidation, while 56% opted to avoid certain campaign activities out of fear for their safety. We reflected on the disturbing level of hostility with the Electoral Commission Chief Executive Vijay Rangarajan, the former SNP MP Hannah Bardell and the Conservative councillor and former parliamentary candidate Thomas Kerr. Vijay, your report highlights the scale of abuse suffered by politicians. No one escapes it, but some get more than others, don't they?
Exactly. So the report we're publishing today is about the experiences in the May election and the UK general election in July. More than half of the candidates who we surveyed, we had a record number of candidates, about 4,500, but more than half of them said they were abused or intimidated in some way. More seriously, the ones who said they had a really difficult time, about 1 in 10 said they had a really difficult time. And that includes things like being followed in the street, obviously a lot of social media abuse. It was really directed even more at women candidates and ethnic minority candidates. So what we saw was women were twice as likely to be abused and ethnic minority 3 times as likely. And it was the sort of thing, being kissed against your will, unwanted touching, some really aggressive, being followed in the street, people videoing what was going on. So it was quite difficult, but this wasn't uniform. It was very much around some candidates, but it's clearly unacceptable what's going on. Well,
Hannah, you were in Parliament for 9 years. Does some of that resonate with what you saw?
It does, sadly, and it was an experience, I think, that even though I had worked in politics previously, I worked for a former First Minister, so I had a pretty good idea of what it was going to be like, but crossing that threshold into actually being elected was very different. So unfortunately, I did have death threats, I did have online abuse, and obviously in the time that I was elected, 2 of my colleagues, Jo Cox and Sir David Amess, were both killed. And after Sir David was killed, my brother came to me and he was like, maybe you should think about doing a different job. And he's a public servant, my mum was a public servant, and so we have a tradition of that in our family, but I think that reality of being out there in the public eye, comes sadly now with huge challenges. But the flip side of that is that we get to do an incredible job, and a job that's very important, and we have to make it possible for anybody, particularly women and people from ethnic minority backgrounds and different minority groups, to stand for election. And that is going to put people off. I mean, I have to say I feel in a difficult position talking about it because I don't want people to put people off. It's an amazing job, but it comes with, unfortunately, significant risks.
Yeah, and it needs to be addressed, doesn't it? I mean, Thomas, you're a councillor, you've been a candidate. What's your experience?
Well, I mean, I've faced a number of abuse myself, but I know particularly female councillors who've faced a lot more abuse than what I have. It goes a range from social media, which is really toxic. Any sort of comments underneath social media feeds from any politician, you'll see the amount of level of abuse about appearances or what you're doing or all these sort of comments. But I've had it to the situation where my office has been vandalised inside the City Chambers, which is a secure building, and that was out in the public domain that had happened a couple of years ago. And last year I was put on taxis by the council because of security concerns after the Israel-Palestine thing kicked off, and I was nearly assaulted in a pub in the East End of Glasgow because somebody had recognised me and disagreed with my views, and it led into this whole thing where the amount of abuse and death threats and things that I was getting led to the situation where police came. I had a panic alarm given to me, my fiancée had a panic alarm given to her because she'd been on my social media, and I was put on taxis for about 6 months because the police were scared about me going on public transport. So, and that's as an elected council, so it's really difficult to then go to young people in particular and encourage them into politics when this is the level of toxicity that exists inside politics.
Yeah, I mean that's shocking what you've both faced. And Vijay, what has led to this very toxic atmosphere, do you think, in politics? Is it social media? What do you think it is?
I think it's a number of things. We don't really have brilliant data about what it is. What we want to do is try and tackle it. It's having the effect, as you said, and I've got enormous sympathy for Hannah and Thomas. We need brilliant candidates out there engaging with voters. It's the absolute core of our democracy. And if people are restricted from standing as a candidate, or they're restricted from interacting with voters, that's a real problem for our democracy. What's causing it may be partly social media, so we're working with the social media firms. What can you take down? We want to have a kind of really free, robust, open debate. So it's not about restricting free speech here. It's about things like threats which are coming across. I think there's a little bit here on age as well. It looks like from our public polling that young people think it's more acceptable to abuse political party candidates, and that's a real problem. So we'd like to do more on education for young people about why candidates are actually the lifeblood of our democracy, and people who stand, who want to have a democratic debate, who are out there in public engaging with voters are absolutely crucial.
Perhaps the age thing, though, is partly to do with the fact that younger people have grown up with social media. I mean, I started in politics in 2007. It wasn't really a thing then, and it was very different. Now we have to be more available on lots of different channels. People expect instantaneous responses. And that's in many ways a good thing. But the flip side of that is I think people have lost the ability to disagree respectfully and instead think it's okay to hide behind, a fake profile. But two interesting things have happened today. So The Guardian have come off Twitter, or X as it's now called, and somebody's been jailed for illegal streaming of the Premier League. Now, the thing about illegal streaming is it's taken, the minute there's an illegal football match, it's taken off. So social media companies have the ability to do this, but it's interesting that money drives it and choices are made. So for anybody who's faced online abuse, and politicians are not unique, by the way, there's lots of people out there who have a public profile, even everyday, particularly women, who just exist in a social space and are pushed out of that. And social media is where so many people interact and live their lives nowadays, arguably too much. But that's a reality. So we need the social media companies, governments, police to work together, but not just be following the money, but also be thinking about the impact that this is having societally.
Yeah, I mean, do you think it's a threat to democracy? I mean, do you know of any young people or people who have thought about standing for office and thought, I'm not going down having seen what you've been through?
I know plenty of candidates who we had who stood in the 2022 council elections, with me in the Glasgow council election, who will not come back to stand as local councillors because they didn't like the barrage of abuse that came with it, particularly on social media. Now, they hadn't felt the same stuff that I had to go through myself, but they had seen all the abuse that then comes with the job once you're inside that role. So I think it has become really toxic, but I think it is right what Hannah's saying about social media regulation. That is really, really key here, and I think governments have to do that because, as Hannah said, it's not just a politician thing. I've got a 14-year-old sister. Some of the comments that's on her TikTok accounts and all this sort of stuff that I see on that regularly is shocking. So there's a bigger issue here, but it is a real threat to democracy. I mean, I was saying to someone earlier on, one of the best things about this country is that you can be Foreign Secretary dealing with a world leader, and the very next day you're in a school hall speaking to your constituents. That's one of the key bedrocks of our democracy. You never want to get to a situation where that is not the case, because it brings in grounds politicians right down to earth again to remind them what it is that we're elected to do. Yeah. And the real worry here is that if this continues, then actually what happens is with the overprotection you end up having a remote politician base that's away from their voters, and that's not the way that it's supposed to be in this country.
We're getting further away from particularly at Westminster, politicians are becoming further and further removed from their constituents.
And therefore out of touch with the people they represent. And therefore out of touch.
And also, just exactly as Thomas is saying, that then you will only get certain types of people who will put themselves forward to stand for election, and they will probably be wealthier, straight white men, and that's not a criticism. There are some fantastic straight white men in politics, but they are the ones who get the least amount of abuse. I mean, Diane Abbott, who's a female black MP, iconic, she received, I think in a previous report that I saw, 50% of all the abuse of everybody in Parliament. And I know from knowing some of her staff, just the horrific stuff that they had to deal with.
It is absolutely horrific. So Vijay, how do we make it a safer place, a kinder place for politicians and elected representatives?
The first thing I'd say is I think this is a bit more general than just Westminster. It's across the whole country, and our data is showing that. As both Hannah and Thomas are saying, it's really almost everywhere. Second, I think there are some things that we can definitely do. So first of all, is setting some of the expectations. We want to work with police, with prosecutors, to make sure that where that line is crossed, I mean, first of all, we've got to be really clear what the line is, but following someone down the street, aggressively filming them, is over the line. Yelling in their families' faces is definitely over the line. Making a threat to them or physically abusing them is clearly over the line. Being really clear where the line is, and then working with police and prosecutors to make sure that is punished. That's really important. Social media is definitely part of it, but notice quite a lot of what I'm saying is it's in the street as well. It's not just social media. I think there may be a little bit of a move over. It's okay to troll someone on social media. So therefore I can say to them in the street. So there is a interlinkage there. But quite a lot of this is actually quite in the street and quite local and quite neighbourhood based. So we need to influence voters and say this is not an acceptable thing to do.
Yeah.
The final thing is just a third of the abuse is coming from other candidates, according to candidates themselves in our polling. So we need to work with political parties to make sure this sort of behaviour is not accepted by any political party in the UK.
So the politicians themselves have to set an example then?
Absolutely we do. And I think we can all do better. I think the vast majority of people are pretty reasonable in politics, but there will always be people who cross a line. And unfortunately, Westminster in particular, the nature of the debate, it's so adversarial and people attacking each other. That's what people see and it puts them off.
But it does, it wraps all over though, because in the council, I mean, I've been in the council now for 2 terms. Some of my best friends are in different parties, but some of the other councillors are amazed that I get on with people in different parties. We need to break down that toxicity that exists.
So you're setting a brilliant example. Well, thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I'm quite shocked with some of what you said, but thank you all very much indeed for